Thanks very much, Greg, and look, very nice to see everybody today. I thought, so we build this as a bit of a Q&A session. I thought I might sort of try to frame a little bit. Pete kind of took a lot of my thunder by talking about the trade recovery strategy, so I wanted to kind of situate the trade recovery strategy as part of a broader overarching sort of plan as we move out of the pandemic, as we inevitably will. What's the plan then for getting out there? Now, before we do that, I thought I'd also talk a little bit about the sort of the international context at the moment. I do see there's sort of three big themes out there at the moment. The first is clearly uncertainty, and that's around, you know, the extent of the health crisis. You know, in the Apec context, we've been saying 100,000 new cases a day since November 2020 last year, and 1 million deaths. This is in our region alone, and no sign of that pandemic actually slowing down. In fact, throughout our region, there's been now a sharp increase again, particularly in Southeast Asia. So clearly the health effects are significant, and they're clearly having an impact on the way people are thinking about their trade policy and so on. And that brings me to the sort of the economic impact. The first point to make is over the weekend, the Prime Minister hosted the Apec leaders meeting. So brought together the 21 leaders to talk about, you know, what was going to be the response to the crisis. The IMF gave a presentation there, and they talked about the recovery being well underway, that, you know, we can expect 6% growth across the Asia-Pacific region, and that employment would start to pick up, and that crucially for us and for you as exporters, demand should start to pick up. That was a really good story, and I don't want to puncture the bubble, as it were, but one of the big challenges of that data was very high dependence on China growth. So the China growth figure drove the 6% there. If you took China out of that, or if you assume that China starts to slow, the figures look pretty sickly for the rest of us over that period, including both in employment, in terms of incomes back into our economy, in terms of productivity. And we know that exporting is a crucial part of the driving of our own domestic growth. So I use the standard framework. I always say, if you're an exporter, you tend to pay better wages, between 7 and 12% better. You also, than a non-exporting firm. If you're an exporting firm, you're also 25% more productive than a non-exporting firm. And of course, 1 in 4 New Zealand jobs, as you saw from Pete's presentation as well, depends on those open markets internationally. So it's a crucial part of driving our domestic growth. So critically, what happens in terms of the uncertainty, the economic uncertainty that COVID is creating, is going to have an impact on us as well. But let's assume that the IMF has got it right, and I'm hoping that they have, and that demand does start to pick up. That will improve prices across the board, and there's good sense that there isn't just going to be an agriculture story, but actually, and I know many of you here today are manufacturers, that there's going to be a manufacturing boost there as well in terms of the improvement in prices as that demand starts to pick up. So that first piece is around that uncertainty, because that economic picture depends very much on us being able to grapple with the health element. And there, a big part of that, of course, is the vaccine rollout. I won't get into the domestic story about that, but internationally, we are starting to see improvements about that, and that does seem to be mitigating the worst effects of the health crisis internationally. So that uncertainty, which we're hoping will kind of start to stabilise over the next 6 to 8 months, then feeds into the second big challenge that we face internationally, and that is, and there's no other way to put it, it's the geopolitics. It's the relationship between, and crucially in our part of the world, it's the relationship between China and the United States, how that gets worked through, and how it is that the trade and economic architecture is going to need to evolve around and to manage all of this. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what our strategy is around all of that kind of management piece. The third area, unfortunately, is protectionism. We are an open economy ourselves. We depend on those markets being open. All the signs over the last 18 months have been very negative on that front. Protectionism has risen, and it's the tricky kind of protectionism. It's not just the tariff increases, it's the non-tariff barriers. It's the additional certification, regulatory requirements that you're going to be required to meet. Sometimes there'll be good reasons for those. Sometimes they are pure purely designed to keep you out, to keep domestic firms more competitive, and therefore to improve that domestic situation in country X and Y, and therefore keep you out. That's why a crucial part, a really crucial part of the trade strategy has been about trying to help companies break down those barriers. You must tell us when you have a problem. So if you find a certificate or a requirement being imposed on you that you think may be unfair, you just need to let us know. So go to the MFAT website, go to the NZT website, go to the MPI website. There's no wrong door. We are here to help. There's a team in my group. Some of them are here. I can see some of them around the room. Their job is to find ways to break down those barriers for you. So when you find a problem, you need to let us know. Can't promise to fix them all, but I can tell you that we will be very responsive. We will give you a response within 48 hours that we're picking up your problem, that we're starting to talk with other agencies, and then we'll develop a strategy with you to break that barrier down, or we'll be very honest about the fact, actually, that's a legitimate certification requirement. Nothing we can do to help you. But you will get that fast. So you'll have some certainty about the way in which we respond, and we're very practical, and we look to break down these barriers because we know it's really critical for you. So a real message from me, please, is just to let us know when you have a problem. mfat.govt.nz, click through to the trade recovery strategy. There's a portal there you can register. There's an 0800 number you can use. We really do want to hear from you. The other thing that I did want to kind of promote is that on our website, and linked through from NZTE as well, are a number of sort of market intelligence reports that we update frequently. They're free, they're a quick read, so a page, page and a half, 2 pages, sometimes they run to 3. They're designed to give you a quick snapshot of what's going on. When you read that report, let us know if you need more information, if you want something bespoke, developed for you out of our embassy in Japan, our embassy in China, our embassy in Brussels, wherever it might be, we will do everything we can to help you. Again, please just let us know. So look, those are the 3 big themes, the sort of uncertainty, the geopolitics, the big challenge that faces us, and then, of course, this rising protectionism, which is in a very practical way affects you day to day. That then brings me to the challenge that we face. Small economy, distant, and all of the challenges that we've got normally have been exacerbated by COVID. So what are we looking to do? Well, Pete talked about the first part of that strategy, which is the immediate term trade recovery strategy. I always think of it as the 3 R's. It's the retooling of exporter support. So it's the breaking down trade barriers. It's helping you in market. By the way, we know you can't travel. So if you need to meet a client or to meet a customer and you'd rather that the embassy or NZTE colleagues went in to see those customers, that's what we're there for. That's what this network offshore can do to help you, is tell us who you want us to go and talk to, and we can see if staff from the embassies or from the consulate or from the NZTE office can go in and see colleagues there. And of course, we have colleagues from Customs, MPI, and MB as well in various embassies, so there's a range of things that we can do for you. That's the first R of the strategy, retooling exporter support. The second is the reinvigoration of the trade architecture. That's all about our free trade agreements, and I want to come to that shortly. And the third area is the refreshing of trade relationships. That's what the Minister's doing, not just the Minister of Trade and Export Growth, but Minister Mahuta as well. Every Zoom call that they make is designed to kind of refresh and remind people, New Zealanders here, still doing business, wanting to do good business, wanting to export. So that is going to be a key part of our strategy, as well as that third strand of just refreshing those relationships, reminding people that we're here. And the Minister, of course, is going to be on the road again shortly, probably in October, travelling to Europe and elsewhere. And again, of course, he'll have to do MIQ. But that is part of trying to get us back into that international environment, trying to build support for what it is you're all trying to do. So look, that's the trade recovery piece of it. The long-term kind of strategy, the overarching one, is in 6 parts. The first, the Minister talked about, so I won't go into detail on that, is the World Trade Organization. It's the foundation. It's the set of rules that, let us all be honest about it, we've all taken for granted. Those are the rules that mean that people can't, that it's harder for people to cheat you. It also gives you certain certainty and guarantees about what kind of tariff can be imposed on you at a particular moment in time, and those rules have been legally enforceable. The problem that we've got at the moment is the United States, even under the new administration, continues to resist the appointment of new judges to this panel, which actually enforces those rules. Now, the fact that we don't have a functioning panel puts this all in jeopardy. So something that we've taken for granted since the 1990s is very much under threat at the moment. So one of our big pushes is to try to sustain support for that international set of rules. The second strategy, the second strand of our strategy is all about our free trade agreement agenda. And as I said, I keep promising this, I will come back to that, but the free trade agreement agenda is a very straightforward one. It's about, number one, levelling the playing field. So if we're talking about the EU and the UK, those are actually about levelling the playing field. Then there's the ones where we look to get advantage, where we look to be the first, or among the first, to finish the agreements. The ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA, the China FTA are examples of that part of the strategy in action. The third area is what we're looking to do in the interim as the WTO is struggling, and we've got these mega free trade agreements that we're negotiating. We're also negotiating what we're calling open plurilaterals. These are smaller agreements that are designed either to break new ground and ensure that New Zealand is helping shape rules internationally, or trying to respond to sort of big challenges that we face out there like climate change. And the Minister talked about two of those very specific agreements. One is the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. That's an attempt by 3 small economies, New Zealand, Singapore and Chile, basically to set the rules that would help us as a small economy with largely small and medium enterprises in the tech sector, looking to have rules that actually work for us, rather than waiting for the rules to be imposed on us by the Amazons and the Alibabas and the others internationally, actually trying to set these rules ourselves. So trying to do a bit of pathfinding and trying to set a bit of norm setting by ourselves. By the way, some very practical things too. So the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement has a template for electronic invoicing, for electronic certification, for the recognition of electronic signatures. At the moment, we don't have rules that guarantee that the way in which you send your digital certificate across will actually be recognised and upheld by the Customs Administration at the other end. So these rules are critically important because they give you that certainty and stability. Obviously, it's not enough just to be thinking about Chile and Singapore, which is why we've been really pleased that both Canada and Korea have expressed interest in joining the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. The Minister talked about the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability. I won't devote particular time, but I'm happy to take questions on that one separately. The fourth area is Apec. So this is the idea that we invest and sustain us, and we take responsibility, we're the chair this year, in supporting Apec as the leading regional economic forum and also as a forum that is an incubator of good ideas. And you heard the Minister talk about some of those good ideas, things on environmental services, the work that's being done on making sure we can move COVID-19 essential goods across borders, and a very practical outcome that came from here, and the authors here, April Kwak is here, who designed this, the best practice guidelines for customs administrations. That ministers of trade endorse that. That is the way in which you move COVID-19 essential goods across borders more quickly, more securely, and that is the kind of thing that actually does make a difference to day-to-day lives, because it means that we can make sure that the vaccine rollout across our region really happens in the most efficient way possible. So really important work that Apec does in a norm-setting sense that then eventually, we hope, will actually drive part of our recovery, both in a health sense and an economic sense. The fifth area is what we call economic diplomacy. To be blunt, this is a continuation of the trade recovery strategy, very much about supporting you in terms of the market intelligence reports that we produce, helping you break down trade barriers. The last area, again, the Minister touched on this, is the Trade for All strategy. What's really important about the Trade for All strategy is it's not just about sustainable development. It's actually about the regions of New Zealand, it's about the small and medium enterprises, it's about Maori exporters, and it's about women exporters as well. Those are the framing elements of Trade for All. that are actually designed to make sure that actually the benefits of trade go back and are utilised by all parts of New Zealand, whether you're in the regions, whether you're an SME, whether you're a Māori exporter or a women exporter, which our data shows are underrepresented in a lot of the places that we need growth to be maximised. So look, that's the overarching strategy. That's 6 parts: WTO, free trade agreements, open plurilaterals, the smaller agreements, the Apec, supporting Apec and other institutions that can help us drive norms that eventually become the hard rules that we all rely on, and then economic diplomacy, and then finally the Trade for All agenda. Those are the overarching pieces. Just on the free trade agreement negotiations, so the 2 really big ones at the moment are clearly the United Kingdom. That negotiation's underway at the moment, the team working through the night over the last couple of days and then for the next week or so to try to bring that deal together. Ministers set us the Minister was absolutely right. There were some anxious moments as we heard about this August deadline for agreement in principle. That requires an enormous amount of work to get that across the line. It'll be a document that will run to sort of 14 or 15 pages that will capture at a high level what the agreement will contain, which is what the Australians also got about 6 weeks ago now. And that will form the basis through which we then negotiate the final part of the free trade agreement between New Zealand and the United Kingdom. So a really important negotiation that we really do need to finish in August. A lot riding on that for New Zealand. Certainly to close the gap with Australia, to be really blunt about it. Frankly, there's a lot riding on it for the United Kingdom as well. They do want to join CPTPP, and this is a key pathway, or key part of their pathway to membership, is being able to finish this free trade agreement with New Zealand as well. On the EU side, as the Minister said, we're about to start our 5th year of negotiation with the European Union here. As you'd expect, with a 27-member economy grouping, it's pretty hard work to get that process going. Our latest round involved 34 meetings, all sort of basically in the night, over 20 chapters that we're negotiating. We're actually negotiating about 24 chapters, but 4 of those chapters we're unable to meet. They're now going to meet over the coming 3 to 4 weeks. So an intensive effort made to try to bring that process forward, and the critical element, in my view, to driving that momentum is going to be further ministerial engagement. So the Minister gave a good jolt to the negotiations, to us as negotiators, when he met with his Trade Commissioner counterpart in Brussels. And then we're looking to meet again in October in person with the European Union, again to give it a real push at political level to get this through. Clearly, the UK, no secrets here, the UK and the EU negotiations are really important. The obvious point is that the EU is our 3rd most important trading partner, but it's our most important trading partner where we currently don't have a preference. So to give you a practical example of that, it means that if you're a honey exporter to the European Union, you pay a 17% tariff. So out of every $100 you send, $17 of that goes to the Brussels Customs Administration. All of your top 9 competitors in the European Union market don't pay a tariff. So they go in at 0, they send $100, they can spend $100. We send $100, but $17 gets extracted as a consequence of the tariff. So there is a gap there. It's an unsustainable gap for exporters. The manufacturing tariffs for New Zealand range between 2% and 5% into the European Union market. Your main competitors, unless they're from Australia, are trading in at 0. So again, the competitive edge that we don't have in the European Union, that clearly needs to be put into place, and the free trade agreement is a critical part of delivering that. So look, what I might do is I might stop there, and we'll turn to the sort of the Q&A. What I might just close by saying is to reassure you that we've got this immediate term strategy, the trade recovery strategy, the 3 Rs, and then we've got this overarching strategy, so a plan that takes us beyond the pandemic, that helps build both a resilience and a revival of our export-led, our trade-led recovery. It's not just about exports, it's actually about imports as well. So that strategy is all about smoothing out the edges and mitigating some of the risks for us internationally, And look, there are plenty of risks, there are plenty of uncertainty out there, but there is a plan from the government here, and what you're seeing is across agencies a real commitment to make that work and make it work for you. And my last word is, if you have a problem, you need to let us know. We've got really good people, not just in my group, but across government, who are really committed to helping you, and we will do everything we can to deliver for you.
Thank you very much, Vangelis. So Q&A now, we've got about 10 or 15 minutes, the same rules as last time. There's 2 mics. Stick your hand up if you've got a question, and please tell us who you are and the company that you're from. We've got one just in the middle here, thanks.
Jason Reeves from the BNZ. Many thanks, Vangelis. Good to see you again. Just a follow-up to my earlier question to the Minister this morning. Australia has concluded their FTA with the UK. As a rough guideline, would New Zealand look to, in terms of the benefits, have at least the minimum or the equal of what Australia has, and ideally slightly better, as we had a chance to have a look at their agreement before we finalise our one?
Yeah, I mean, one of the advantages, of course, we've seen what Australia has done, and I mean, full credit to Australia. The deal that they've got with the United Kingdom is a really good one. It is a genuinely good one, and I think that's good for all of us. It's good for the UK in terms of its membership of CPTPP. It's good for us because we're now coming to negotiate with them, and clearly we couldn't do a deal that was worse than Australia's. So we're certainly looking at the deal across the board to make sure that, you know, as a bare minimum, we're getting what Australia got and we're getting the same treatment. We wouldn't want to be at a disadvantage. And then in particular areas, of course, where we believe we are a bigger exporter and a bigger provider. Dairy is an obvious example, but there may be other sectors and subsectors where we would clearly want to do at least as well, if not better. The challenge, and just to be really blunt about it, the challenge is that for the United Kingdom, the New Zealand market is a small one. We are already very open for the United Kingdom, and so the value for the UK is relatively modest. And they've made that point quite bluntly to the Minister when we were in London, and they made the point that with Australia there were some big tariffs that Australia still has in place, cars and other areas, so there were big benefits for the UK. They don't see quite the same benefits for us, so this is one of the big challenges that we have as negotiators, is finding a way to make sure that we're not a worse off. But clearly the political economy of being seen to be worse off than Australia out of this deal would not be acceptable.
And just to follow up to that, if I may, I think, for example, perhaps for the UK, is that if they can successfully conclude 2 agreements with Australia and New Zealand, that indicates their kind of pedigree and their ability to perhaps negotiate further for a CPTPP. So I think there is some real advantage for the UK to conduct a good agreement with New Zealand.
We definitely agree.
Thanks, Jason. Any other questions? There must be something else out there. Thank you. I see Ruben.
Thank you, Vangelis. Ruben Azizian from Massey University, and it will be a slightly academic question, if you don't mind. You mentioned the importance of the free trade agreement with UK and their entry into CPTPP. But there is another school of thought that believes that proliferation of free trade agreement bilaterally undermines the multilateral trade and economic structure. And this is what previous US administration was actually advocating in some ways. So how do you see that evolving? Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and it's a question that has been one that's, I think, worried New Zealand for a long time. The idea is basically that the more that people are doing these deals outside of the WTO framework, outside the international set of rules, the more you undermine the system. You take away resource from negotiating it. You also set new standards and new rules that might be below the WTO standard, and you start to undermine it. And there's a big trade economist, Bagwati, called it the termites in the system. He described these free trade agreements as termites in the system. As an economist myself, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think this is one of the really big risks, is that this proliferation of agreements and as it's been called, the noodle bowl in the Asia Pacific of these different rules and standards that you as exporters then need to navigate. I needed one standard for Korea, a different standard for Singapore, a different certificate to go to Chile as a consequence of the various agreements that we've negotiated. This is one of the big challenges we face. I think the brutal reality is for a small economy like ours, we've had to get into that game. It's the way in which we get into that game that I think then becomes important. What you can't do is agreements that undermine WTO standards. So what you really need to do is you need to have WTO plus agreements. So agreements that go forward, and that if you are negotiating in a way, so for example, our open plurilateral agreements, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement and so on, we've made that commitment. If we're going to change our electronic invoicing system for the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, we'll make it available to everybody. That's a way of supporting the WTO. So this idea of WTO plus agreements, but also where necessary, extending the benefits more widely, I think is a really important principle to try to support and shore up that trading system. I think the real risk we see at the moment is we have a WTO meeting at the end of the year. These happen normally every 2 years. It was delayed from last year for obvious reasons. It's not at all clear how and what we're going to deliver at the end of the year. But what is important is that we must find a way to sustain the WTO. And just to elaborate on my earlier point about how important the system has been to New Zealand, the WTO offers you this legally enforceable set of rules. It means that a small economy like ours can take a big economy to court, take a case against them and win. So we've taken cases against Canada, we've taken cases against the United States, we've taken a case against the European Union, we've taken one against Indonesia most recently, and then we've taken one, of course, most famously against Australia on apples. I'm convinced that in the absence of that WTO rules-based system and that functioning dispute settlement mechanism, we would not have been able to change the US administration's mind on lamb access bilaterally. So by going in and asking and sending in the ambassador to complain about things, that wasn't working. When we took them to court and their regime was found not to be in compliance with WTO rules, they had to change their system, they had to bring it into line with international rules and allow us to trade fairly back into the system. Same with the Canadians, same with the Indonesians, same with the Australians, and of course with the European Union on butter. So this system, which has served us so well, that's the system that's very much under threat now. I think what's also very revealing, to come to your point, Ruben, is we haven't actually used the dispute settlement mechanisms within free trade agreements. So as an international, as all of the economies that are involved in these kinds of agreements, it's really interesting to see that 99% of the cases are being taken through the Geneva process in the WTO, less than 1%, and this is the case with the US is the only actor that's taken some cases through its free trade agreements. Normally, we just use that WTO system. That's another really important thing. And we must not forget that for us, it's been a crucial way as a small economy to be able to say, hey, if the rules are not fair, there is a system over here that makes it fair. And you as a big economy, you need to listen to that. My big fear is that the longer the system doesn't have the functionality that it used to have, that it had 2 years ago, the longer that lasts, the more that the big economies think they can behave with impunity. And if you look at some of the actions, and this is an action, I'm afraid, that goes to the European Union, it goes to the United States, it goes to China, it goes to India, who are ramping up their domestic support systems, both for agriculture, but also we're seeing it in manufacturing as well. That kind of thing is actually right up against the rules. But if they're thinking that they can behave with impunity and that no one can take them to court anymore, that's a serious problem for us as a small player. So, that underlines for me the significance and the importance that we place on the WTO. And we're not alone, of course. There's 164 members of the WTO. More than 100 of them are small economies like us. So that we've got a group of people to work with to try to sustain that system.
Thank you, Ruben. See 2 more questions. We'll go to the front first.
Yeah, my name is Frank Olson, and I'm with the New Zealand Europe Business Council. And you touched on geopolitical tensions. and it seems that the gap is opening up between what the politicians want and what their businesses want. If we look at all the countries you've mentioned, more or less, have China as their #1 trading partner, including the US, and where is this all going to go if the US companies want to continue to do lucrative business in China and the politicians are going the other way? Thank you.
I like the easy questions, yeah. Look, so it is, as an objective fact, China for us is a key trading relationship, as indeed it is throughout the region. So if you look at the Asia Pacific members, China is a key partner for almost all of those, and if it's not the #1, then it's #2 or #3. But for 18 of the 21 Apec economies, China is the #1 trading partner and has been a key part of all of our abilities to kind of recover. Now, the trading relationship is one thing, and it's a really important driver of export growth here, of employment, of productivity, and so on. At the same time, what you hope to have with China is to have a mature relationship where you can talk about the range of things that are important to New Zealanders, not just business, but to New Zealanders in general as well as business. And that's, I think, the kind of relationship that we need to have with China. At the same time, of course, we are faced with a challenge that we've had for nearly 30 years, which is diversification. And that is a major part of what we've been trying to do. So the negotiations with the EU have been going 5 years, nearly 5 years. We've been trying to launch that negotiation for over a decade. So this isn't a new strategy that we've suddenly invented, this diversification strategy. It's been a key part of our need to level the playing field. It's all very well to say to exporters, and I can vividly remember an exporter in Invercargill that was with us in a trade mission to China saying to me, it's all very well to tell me to diversify. 99% of his product was going into the China market. Price is great. By the way, I don't pay a tariff. You tell me I should go to the EU. I've just looked up your website. The tariff in the EU is 12%. My main competitor is Canada. They have a trade agreement with the EU, and the tariff is 0 for them. 12% for me, 0 for them. I can't be in that market. In China, I'm at 0 as the exporter of crayfish or lobsters. The Canadians are at 14%. So if we're going to talk about diversification, we are actually going to need these free trade agreements to give us that levelling of the playing field so people have choice. And then businesses can make their own decisions about where they need to be. It's not my business to tell people where they should go or where they should export, but it is my business to try to make sure that there are those opportunities and those opportunities are fair. Now, to give you another practical example from the EU, the tariff on kiwi fruit is 8.4% for us. It's been like that forever, since the end of the Uruguay round. For the Chileans, our major competitor there, for the last 7 years, it's been 0. 8.4% for New Zealand kiwi fruit, 0 for Chileans. The competitive advantage for the Chileans is significant. What's incredible to me is that, Zespri's been able to stay in the market there. That's mirrored across. You have 5% to 22% for fish. I gave the example of honey, 17%. We simply cannot sustain that gap, and that's a really important part of what the strategy is designed to do, is to level that playing field, and then people can make choices.
Thank you, Frank. We've got time for just one more question, but remember, Vangelis is here at lunchtime, so if you do want to grab him, then please do so. Thank you.
Yeah, Murray Parish, same related question about levelling up the playing field. How do we go about challenging something like a border adjustment tax on an ethical or sustainable standard? Climate change is often cited. People are using measures of carbon footprinting as a basis for trade protection. How can you challenge that, and what's the science or evidence base on which we can rely in thinking we could or couldn't challenge?
So the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is the EU's recently announced, I think on the 14th of July, measure by which they would apply an additional tariff on particular products to try to, as they say, level the playing field. It's based on what their carbon price is in another market where there isn't a carbon price. they would then adjust the tariff against that. And I must say, I come to this with two perspectives. One, as an economist, I can see the point. You're internalising the externality. You're saying, right, this is a mechanism by which, if I've got a carbon price and the other partner doesn't, this is how I'd measure them up. On the trade side, though, I must admit that there's some anxiety about this, and there is a general perception that there's a risk that this becomes a protectionist measure, that actually it becomes a revenue-raising tool, number one, that it also becomes a mechanism by which you can kind of protect your domestic industries against what you see as unfair competition and using an environmental standard to do that. What I think is important, though, is that the EU messaging has been very clear. This will be a WTO-compliant, WTO-consistent mechanism. So they've openly said that, and we should see that that actually is, in fact, consistent. And I've always said there's a sort of a set of principles by which we would assess this. The first is clearly WTO compliance. The second is it needs to be a measure that is the least trade restrictive. It needs to be transparent. It needs to be science-based. So we do need to understand that the way in which they've measured the carbon price domestically and the way in which they've adjusted it to whichever economy they're applying the carbon tax, that is actually, that there is some science to that it is not a case like that. Now, reading through the material they've produced, they've clearly done a lot of work to try to reassure people about those elements. The other ones are that it's got to be proportionate. So yes, if the carbon price in one economy is much lower than the other, and you're adjusting it, then the gap should be the distance between the lower carbon price and the higher carbon price between the two markets. It shouldn't be some arbitrary kind of increase over and above. So there's a level of complexity there. But again, that point about proportionality becomes a very important principle, I think, as we look at the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Crucially too, and to survive any WTO test, this has to actually, the EU has to have engaged in good faith consultations with partners. And I think that's going to be a very important test of their willingness to ensure WTO consistency, is the extent to which they talk to us, and not just us, but a whole range of other partners who've got very strong views on this mechanism as well. So I think the important thing is to focus on, they've said it's going to be WTO compliant, and I think that's going to be a very important test for them. The other observation I'd make is that the initial focus for the CBAM, this mechanism, has been steel, aluminium, fertilisers and chemicals, I think. And actually, that makes sense because those are probably the four main areas where you actually have a reasonable data set and a time series that goes back at least a decade in terms of measuring embedded carbon flows and how you do that. So they have picked the ones that one could actually say something sensible about. The test now is how they actually implement this and whether they are as good as their word in terms of WTO compliance. And as I said, there are some certain principles that they do need to demonstrate.
Thank you.
It's a nice long answer.
As ever, Vangelis, thank you very, very, very much for your time and for the very, very compelling presentation on the importance of our trade agenda for us, for NFAT, obviously, but also for all of you, for New Zealand exporters. We're going to have the agency panel now, so just